Oh, what? We're live. Chris, you're supposed to be in charge of this.
I know, it sounded like you were getting ready to say something. I didn't want to miss it. It had the air of importance.
No.
And we're live. Welcome everybody to hashtag SPSM. I don't do the thing as well as April. Yeah, just gonna skip that. Actually, not gonna try to emulate April at all, just to be on the safe side. But welcome everybody to hashtag SPSM. Thank you for joining us with what will inevitably be a very special episode. April, as you can see...
Wait, Chris, it's Hayek. Tony, it's Hayek.
Hayek, sure.
Yeah. Hayek.
Yeah.
Right. We were discussing...
libertarian economists of the 1940s. Moving on.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So, thank you again for joining us tonight. April is obviously not here. She is in an undisclosed location.
China. Where's she at in China, Tony?
Jian, China, in the Shandong province. Some of my favorite dumplings come from there.
That's very impressive. Xi'an and the Yongding. Am I doing that right?
No, that's not right at all. No, not even close. I mean, I'm probably not really close, but at least that's what the letters
say. You say it again. You say it again.
Jian in the Shandong
that's what I said.
Province.
Xi'an in the Shandong province.
Yes, just a hop, skip, and a jump from the birthplace of Confucius.
There we go. Sorry, Chris.
Absolutely
I didn't mean to interrupt.
So April is clearly in a very disclosed location. Yeah, she's presenting. Yep. So April's out. We are going to just move through this, and the whole point of tonight's show is to not only get some feedback from you all about what kind of ticks you off, but also to throw some ideas at Bart and hear what he has to say.
You didn't introduce yourself. You didn't tell the folks who you are.
You're absolutely right. I'm Chris Maxwell. I'm the communications coordinator for the American Association of Suicidology. Bart, who are you?
I am Dr. Bart Andrews. I am the Vice President of Telehealth, Home and Community Services at a groovy little crisis agency in St. Louis, Missouri called Behavioral Health Response. I am also on the executive committee of the American Association of Suicidology, an organization, I just learned this is interesting, that started the same year that I was born, 1968. Tony, did you know this?
I did know this.
The birth year of the American Association of Suicidology. We are super excited that I'm stealing some thunder from you, Tony. We've got a conference coming up.
Do we?
What?
Yes.
When?
Yes. When? What are the dates for that conference, Tony?
That's Chris. Chris does that part.
Chris, what are the dates for the conference?
April 18th through the 21st, guys.
Yes. Thank you, Chris. And so we've got a big conference coming up with lots of big names at that conference. It's going to be amazing. And this, we're going to lead it on to Tony Wood. Tell the folks who you are, Tony Wood.
Hey, everybody. I'm Tony Wood. I'm the COO of Quantify, software company dedicated to mental health and data science. I am also the chair of the board of the American Association of Suicidology. What else?
Where can people go to sign up if they want to become a member of AAS?
Oh, heavens, suicidology.org, Chris.
And now I just made you do my job, so that felt good.
Good job.
Okay, so yeah, like we were talking about just a second ago, what we're going to do is kind of look at what you guys are tweeting at us. I had posted a Facebook post yesterday asking you all to kind of give us some prompts, some ideas of things that you wanted to talk about and chat about and complain about. So I think unless you guys have anything that you want to talk about, we can jump right into some of these prompts.
I have something.
Some boring current events. What did you say, Bart?
Do we want to talk Stormy Daniels first? Was that?
No, I think we're going to skip over Stormy Daniels. We're going to go straight to suicide prevention.
Suicide prevention. Okay, what were the? Sorry.
We've had a couple of exciting things happen this week. I think some interesting stuff. Right.
Fill us in, Tony.
Well, there's been a little fracas about gun violence in the United States. Specifically that at this sort of spate of school shootings, we might have noticed it in the news. No, just me.
Yeah, I'm very aware of the school shootings. In fact, I am, and I know that the youth are out there protesting and marching. There was really big marches yesterday, correct, Tony?
Yep.
All over the country. In fact, in D.C., the crowd was bigger than at certain unnamed presidential current administration's inauguration crowds. Can I say that on the air?
I think you just did.
I did. So there was a lot of conversation about that on the Twitter spheres, by the way. I will say that I stay out of the conversation on the Twitter spheres around that issue at this point because the conversations aren't particularly open, engaging. There isn't a whole lot of.
No, they're a little polarized, I think, at the moment.
No, there's not a whole lot of discussion. There's a lot of virtue signaling and a lot of really mean things being said back and forth that I don't find particularly productive. But I'm all for people getting out there and speaking their mind appropriately. How do you feel about people? How do you feel about this, Chris?
Well, what I know is that obviously firearms and suicide intersect pretty directly. A majority of suicides are suicides by firearm. And if you are interested on what AAS's perspective on that intersection is, we actually released, I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago now, a firearms and suicide policy paper. That was the culmination of a lot of work by a lot of really, really brilliant minds. And so that lays out pretty much where we stand with firearms and suicide. Mike Anestis has also put out a lot of really, really good research regarding what he thinks we can do legislatively to make an impact on some of those numbers too.
Yeah, and I think there's some things that we can say about this that I think that are scientific and shouldn't cause a lot of consternation. I will tell you that whenever I talk about guns and suicide, one of the first things that people who are very upset about any mention of using legislation to change the way that we access guns in this country is they say, well, look at South Korea, look at China, look at Japan, look at their suicide rate, and they don't have ready access to firearms, right? This is a really common discussion point, and it's factual. It's a factual discussion point. So it's something that I like to address so that we can just get it out in the air. This is true. There are countries that have much higher suicide rates than the United States, and in those countries, guns are not a part of their suicide problem. They are not, right? Australia, for instance, has a suicide rate that's very similar to the United States of America, and very few of their suicides are in fact done by gun, right? The percentage of gun suicide deaths in Australia are very, very low. So this is it's a reasonable comment that people make, and it's a fact. This is not speculation. This is very true. But one of the things, and this is one of the things that when we talk about the show, I'm going to lose it. This is an issue I'm going to lose it over. Is that we do know that, What was that, Chris?
I was exclaiming my excitement. Go ahead.
Okay.
Contain yourself, Chris.
It sounded like a Normie Reed to me. Reed. Do you know about the Normie Reed? Yeah, do you know about Okay. Anyway, so what we do know is that the things that drive suicide can be very culturally specific. In the United States of America, we know for a fact that guns are heavily involved and access to guns are heavily involved in what drives our suicide rate. It isn't the same in Japan. It isn't the same in China. It isn't the same in South Korea. It isn't the same in Australia. But we know in the U.S. that, in fact, gun availability is directly connected to the suicide rate. We know that states that have passed laws that are very constitutional, these laws have been held up. They are constitutional. They're in no way an infringement on the Second Amendment. But when you mandate waiting periods, when you mandate universal background checks, And when you restrict firearms from people who are convicted of domestic violence charges, guess what we see? We see significant decreases in the suicide rate, right? So these are, when we talk about legislation, these are legislative tools. Massachusetts has one of the lowest suicide rates in the country. And there was a direct decrease in the suicide rate in Massachusetts following passing these laws. And it was already a relatively low suicide rate state as it was. So we know that legislatively there's things that we can do that also do not infringe on people's right to bear arms, which is the Second Amendment. Hard to get around that big thing in the document that governs our lives on a daily basis. So these are, when you're having these conversations, we can have these factual conversations. You'll hear people that get worked up about these things. But we do know that legislation can help. We also know that some people are really reluctant to talk about legislative tools. And working on legislative options doesn't mean that we shouldn't also be partnering with people who are gun advocates, people who are hunters, people who are into sporting, people who support the Second Amendment vocally have a role to play in suicide prevention as well. These things, in my opinion, are not mutually exclusive, but often people kind of feel that you're either in one camp or the other, and I really disagree with that. I think that we need to be having both of these conversations, but how we have these conversations is really important. And that's one of the things that really irks me, is I don't care so much where you are on the spectrum, but you do need to be able to have an honest conversation without, here's a little secret. Here's one of the things that really upsets me. When you say that people don't agree with you, have blood on their hands, and they're kid killers because they don't agree with you on a gun control issue, I don't think that's a productive or even an accurate way to portray people.
I think maybe that would be the time that the communication is over, right? Like that's
that's we have a word for that. It's called virtue signaling, and it's really bad. It's not conducive to.
Well, it's not correlated with great outcomes. Let's just say that.
You need to check your privilege, Tony.
That's right. You got to check it. You got to check it.
Check it right now. Okay, so I've been wanting to rant about that. There, one of my frustrations out. Next.
Do you have anything to say about mass shootings and murder suicides? They're vanishingly rare. Like, I think we all agree. Everybody in this room agrees that they're vanishingly rare, though they're very disturbing.
Chris, thoughts on mass shootings?
Well, so, I mean, what we've put out in our press releases and what we've kind of focused on is the research done by Thomas Joyner. And he has his book, Perversion of Virtue, where he talks about that connection and that, like, for a majority of either mass shootings or murder-suicides, suicide tends to be the driving factor. And if you think about it, at least the way I think about it, it makes sense. If you're in that mindset and if you have that mentality that you're going to go in and cause all this violence and this awful tragedy to happen, I would assume that a majority of these people do not go into it thinking that they'll come out alive. That suicide piece is a really important aspect of what they're doing. Their goal is to cause as much damage as possible to everyone around them and themselves, I think.
I think that the research suggests that that the plan of suicide occurs and is in existence before the killings take place, right? And so I think that Dr. Joyner's take on this is that suicide is a driving factor and an important element in the subsequent killings that occur. And if you look back over recently, certainly the things that are hitting the paper, the person who engages in this kind of behavior, who kills a bunch of people, often kills themselves, but not always. The Florida shooter did not, for example, right? So I think the biggest challenge that we have with mass shooting events, and Tony alluded to this, is the base rate is so incredibly low, right? It's an incredibly low base rate event. One of the reasons that we're really bad at predicting suicide is because the suicide rate is incredibly low. It's considered a low base rate event. In the United States of America, right now we're between 13 and 14.
Now, there's an important distinction, which I think most of our audience already knows about, but I think we can always be reminded of, and that is fatalities. Deaths from suicide, very low base rate event. Attempts, that are not necessarily lethal. Significantly large, 1.2 million plus annually. Deaths, 40,000. So it's a steep drop.
What is what is the rate of suicide attempts per 100,000? So that's about what? 25 times? We talking about 25 times
deaths,
the rate?
Deaths, yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. The ratio, yeah. It's
so we're talking about 25 times. Right?
Is that right? Is it 25 times?
Yeah, no, it's 25 to 1.
Yeah, there you go.
So that would be a base rate of 325 per 100,000.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing that even 325 per 100,000 is still a pretty low base rate, right?
Yep. So what's the problem with having that low base rate? What does that mean?
Great question, Chris. So this gets and what's the base rate for mass killings? The base rate is not even a full 1 per 100,000. It's a fraction of a fraction per 100,000. I think that, right. It's like there's 330 million people in the country. We've got how many of these? So when you're getting into 0.000 decimal points, so it's an extremely low base rate. Yeah. So here's the problem with low base rate events. With a low base rate event, as you maximize the number of people that you identify at risk, right, with a really low base rate, if I want to predict, 95% of the times that somebody's going to do this, then my false positive rate is going to be astronomical, right? So what we find with low base rate events is that your ability to predict, the more people you want to identify at risk, so that you identify all the people at risk, you generate an exponentially large and increasingly large number of false positives, people who are not going to kill themselves or not going to kill anybody else. And this is the biggest problem and this is one of the things, when you listen to experts talk about predicting violence, they will tell you this. The recent cases we looked at. Now the Vegas guy is a bit of a mystery to us because there has not been a lot released about all the stuff around him. They've been isn't it interesting, in fact, how quiet they've been about the Vegas shooting? It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's that interesting. I think that if you have billions of dollars of an entire industry in an entire region of the country that is dependent upon that business, that them being relatively quiet about it all doesn't shock me very much.
So you think that the gambling industry, that Vegas itself is one of the things that
I don't think it's just gambling. I think it's also entertainment. I think it's everything. Vegas is an adult entertainment town. Like we all know, that's not a shocker. They don't make screws and rakes, and they're not manufacturing farm equipment there, right? Most of what they do is slot machines and cheap Mai Tais. Yeah. So that's what they're up to: concerts, fun and games. That's all they do there. Well, if it's not very good publicity it's not great publicity for your tourist destination to be like, well, there's a little bit of a chance.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. But what we do know is that when you look at these cases and you look at these kids and the people involved in these shootings, the number working at a crisis line, the number of cases and number of threats that we see and hear about that people that fit descriptions like this who never hurt anybody is phenomenal, right? Yeah. So each one of these cases, people say, this is the thing and this is one of the things that I lose it over. People say, oh, well, we definitely could have predicted that this was going to happen. Look, this person actually said that they were going to kill these folks and they had a gun. Yeah. I'm telling you that the FBI will confirm this for you as well. They literally get thousands of these complaints. I don't know how often, but they're literally sifting through millions of these a year, and only a tiny small percentage of these things ever result in somebody hurting somebody else. So think about it. If you're getting 1 million of these reports a year, you're trying to sort through all of this noise, and we do not have a very good system. Now, I will say in the Florida case,
I think we've got a great system. I think there's no way to apply it to this. Law enforcement does a pretty good job. Our overall crime rate in the United States is pretty well managed. But could it be better? Sure, it could be. But this is way out of sight. Like this is If you spend as much resources on shoplifting, you get a dramatic number. You do a much better job of catching actual thieves. If you spend all the resources on trying to find mass shooters, it's going to be real hard to do.
So yeah, it's extremely hard to do. Nor do we really have the tools that predict violence. In fact, when you read the folks that really understand violence prediction, they will tell you, don't try to predict violence. Try to you are basically predicting risk, not predicting the likelihood they're going to be violent, but you're predicting risk, right? Yeah. Their risk level. And then you want to mitigate. What can you do to mitigate? So that really good violence prevention isn't this way that you've got this magical tool that can predict, but it's people that kind of fall into this higher risk category. What are we doing to treat them, to ameliorate their concerns, to make sure they're doing better in life? Those are the things that really tend to prevent these sorts of things. I will also say, and this is a point that I do agree with, I do think that our system for preventing people who are struggling and potentially at risk of violence and restricting their access to firearms is not particularly good. There's lots of holes in their system. There are some states that don't even have a really good system for it. And we don't, here's the other thing that people don't realize, we don't have a really good system for saying when people can have their firearms back or regain access to firearms. So there isn't this really slick system that allows us to evaluate risk, intervene with people, say, hey, this is somebody that should not have firearms for the time being, and then removing that restriction. There isn't a whole lot of a system around that. Some places do it a little better than others, but we don't have really good institutions to deal with these sorts of problems. Ask anybody that's ever taken a firearm away from somebody as part of a safety plan, how do you decide when to give that weapon back? That's a huge, huge challenge. And there's very little research and there's not a whole lot of guidance around this when you give that weapon back. And what does it mean when you give the weapon back? So we just don't, there are certain police departments, for instance, if they take a weapon because person is dangerous to self or others, the person will never get the weapon back.
Yep.
Never comes back. There are other jurisdictions that will, in fact, return the weapon, right? There are some jurisdictions that won't confiscate weapons of any kind. They just won't do it if there isn't a crime. So things are really complicated, and we don't have a national model for this, and we really could use a national model.
Yeah.
Chris, thoughts?
Yeah, no, what I hear you saying, too, is that just like with what we're trying to do with suicide, for mass murder, for mass shootings, it would be really helpful if we could address cultural things way further upstream. If we could provide tools for clinical providers to deal with their clients and their patients in a more effective way, make sure that they're prepared to have these kinds of conversations more effectively, that's where we could potentially make some differences.
I think we need better science. We don't know. I think that most of the better suicide prevention activists, most of the better people in this area, that's what they believe. Like, that's a part of their core belief, is that that's where we think the solution is, somewhere there. But nobody is saying that we know what to do, because we simply don't know. We'd love to have the dollars to do the research. There's a lot of great people who would do a really bang up job if you gave them the money, but they don't have it right now. It's not something that the United States has been interested in, largely because guns in the United States have been an untouchable topic, are really hard to touch. You know, Mike Anestis has done a brilliant job navigating this very carefully. Definitely not an anti-gun researcher. You know, it's very carefully thought through, but it's tough. This is a tough situation. You're not gonna you're not gonna trip over a lot of funding for it.
Well, and like what Bart was saying earlier too, it's about messaging. You know, I have heard over and over and over again, and this is how we try to force this issue in a way that's logical and non-controversial as possible, by saying, you know, I'm not anti-firearm, I'm anti-suicide. But anytime that's said, for some reason the reaction tends to be, there's still a few people who have the reaction of, well, this is a great way to move your agenda, because this is clearly an agenda. And it's reciprocal. We have the people who are calling firearm owners and Second Amendment advocates, child killers and stuff. So it goes both ways.
Yeah, it's definitely a polarizing issue in the United States. It's become I think it's been purposefully co-opted for the benefit of political interests. I think the average gun owner that I know, including myself, is not against finding a better way to manage mental health and firearms. Nobody that owns a gun that I know thinks it's a great idea that if you have a serious problem that you should have full access to all your weapons and your ammunition. Like nobody's thinking that. They just, they have strong feelings about their weapons, but nobody disagrees with safety. There's nobody that I know personally.
I would agree, Tony, and I think that we really end up with this idea that there's a false dichotomy, there's a false choice paradigm that operates in these discussions, and that is either you completely agree that nobody should have guns, and really, if it wasn't for the Second Amendment, we just make sure that we took everybody's guns away, and that would solve the problem, right? Completely. And then you've got another group of folks that say that any attempt to infringe on our rights is a slippery slope, and if you start chipping away at these rights, then it's gonna lead to a tyrannical government. Blah blah blah. So one of the signs that I saw at one of the marches that made me lose it is that the sign was, "Would you rather be safe or free?" Right? Would you rather be safe or free? Right? And I'm sorry, I love you, whoever made that sign. It's the stupidest sign I've ever seen in my entire life, because the Chinese are incredibly safe over there from each other. Their government, on the other hand, takes people at will and does what they want with them. And the first thing that the Chinese government did when it took over was make sure that nobody else had any firearms other than the government. So
the Japanese also exist, as well as the British and the French and the Germans, and those are not totalitarian regimes. They manage their problem better than we manage. Those are older style, longer standing governments that are more homogenous. And have other factors that go along with their crime rate and the way things operate in those countries. So they're very different animals in many ways, right? And that's so it's really comparing things that are very different in terms of what America is and what life is like in America. I think our relationship with firearms clearly has not gotten us the outcome that we wanted. I don't think this is the America that anybody wanted. I think it was. I think there's a lot of things we did want, but I don't think that school shootings and suicides was one of them. I think this might be a side effect of policies we thought were perfect, but weren't.
Well, it's interesting that what people don't understand is that the National Rifle Association, when it first started, was a big advocate of gun control. Right, and they went through a very different iteration in the late 70s or into the 80s. So we've been around this issue, and I think there's a lot of cultural dynamics that are very different about the U.S. than European nations, and that's a whole other conversation. Sure. But I do want to get to a completely unrelated issue. This is one of the things I'm going to lose it over. Where's your yay at, Chris? Yeah, there we go. This is a big issue for me. Panels. We're going to talk about panels. I'm going to do it. We're going to work the panels in. Here's a secret. If you are at a conference and they say it's a panel and it's 4 people and they each do a 15-minute presentation, it's not a panel. Is it, Tony?
No, it's not a panel.
Chris, is that a panel?
I don't know how that got started, but it's not.
It's not a panel. Here's a little secret. It ain't a panel. It's 4 mini presentations, people. A panel is when you have discussants up there who are experts or have perspectives. They introduce themselves, and then a moderator or the crowd asks questions, and then the panel discusses it so that you get different levels of expertise, different levels of different perspectives. If you got a panel and it's 4 different people doing their own presentation, you got mini presentations. So we really need, what would we call that? What would you call it instead of a panel, Tony?
A bad idea. I don't think it works very well.
There we go.
We do it, but I don't think it works very well. I think it satisfies some of our presenters because it's really what some of our presenters want. but that's not what a panel is.
Oh, Anne Marie is really getting antsy about discussing the items they submitted, Chris.
Okay, let's get to the board. Let's get to the board. Okay, by the way, Rudy, I saw your twinsies comment. Thanks, Rudy. I appreciate that. That's really, really, I feel supported.
Hashtag language matters about panels.
Yeah.
I want to read something that Rin Linthicum posted too, because this was a nice little recap of our conversation about research and collection of data regarding firearms and mass shootings and suicides. So she says, yes, this is why we need to focus on precision and recall in addition to overall accuracy when we look at prediction of low base rate behaviors like suicide. Otherwise, easy to get overinflated estimates for how well you're predicting. So that's a perfect recap. Let's jump into the stuff that people posted, and there were a lot. I had like 30 comments.
I'm going to say one thing, and then we're going to go right to the list. But I can't let this low base rate thing pass without saying this. There are a few companies. There are several companies right now that are out on the internet telling people that they can predict this or they can detect that using language. And that's what we do at Quantify. We do natural language processing. I can tell you that a list of keywords, no matter how big they are, is not going to solve any of these problems. And there's not, and I assure you, there's not just one company. I watch the internet for this as part of what my job is. And there's several companies that are out there selling technology, mostly to frightened people. Especially school districts right now, they're selling this thing to schools in order to try to, to detect violence in social media, and the likelihood of the accuracy there. And all I say is, don't buy anything unless you see, if you're in the position to influence these things, don't buy anything unless they show up with published literature explaining how they're going to produce that for you. Otherwise, it's just made up, not real. Okay, sorry.
Okay, so let's jump in. Like I said, I got like a bunch of comments yesterday, so I don't know if we're gonna be able to get to all of them. We might try to do some sort of speed round at the end if we can. But I want to hit Jess Stolman-Rainey's couple of points first, because I think this is something that doesn't get enough attention. And really her main comments were about marginalization of both people who have been affected by suicide, people who have thoughts of suicide, and then people who are trying to get into the field itself and interact with others to help prevent this. So she very, very decently put suicide prevention so white. So that's number one. She mentioned paternalism. And then she also mentioned that production of and access to knowledge limited to academic institutions from which people experiencing mental health concerns are systematically excluded from. So, Bart.
Okay, so we've got three things there, right? We've got suicide prevention be so white.
Mm-hmm.
Was that at the top of the list?
Documentary, that young woman who's an attempt survivor said hashtag suicide so white. It's a great moment.
She did.
In the S word, which if they're showing near you, I recommend you go see it.
This is a huge challenge, and we've got this is not my area of expertise, but I have done some reading and familiar with some of the challenges around this. There are several things that are really problematic about this. One, in certain cultures, the level of prejudice and discrimination around open and honest conversation around suicide is much higher than in other cultures. And so, in fact, and you can make the same thing exist around LGBTQ issues as well, that the level of cultural acceptance in certain subcultures in the United States of America make it much harder for people of marginalized communities to actually discuss their struggles with suicide openly, right? There's a
in the United States.
In the United States of America, yes. but in other parts of the world as well. I would imagine you see similar trends as well. There was in fact a great study that they did, and I want to say they did this in Belgium, where they found one of the things that predicted suicide, one of the most interesting variables, was people's willingness to discuss their suicide crisis with a family member. willingness to discuss with a professional did not at all indicate risk level or protection, but willingness to discuss it with your family. In fact, that the groups that were willing to discuss their thoughts of suicide with a family member had like a third to a fourth of the suicide rate of groups that were not willing to discuss it with a family member. So there's natural cultural elements that contribute to this. A part of it is reflected by when you look in the research community and where people of color and from different communities are going into academia. I'm not sure that psychology and social work are where that's happening at the highest level, and part of it's recruitment, right? So this is a really ongoing challenge. We have the same thing with having representation from women. There's been lots of times when SPSM has wanted to have a more women voices on the show, and we've had a really hard time getting women to come onto the show who are experts and can do this sort of thing. There's lots of barriers there. And so
they're out there.
They are, right? Maybe women are too smart, aside from Doc Foreman, to commit to being on a show at 10 o'clock on a Sunday evening. Mm-hmm. That's a strong possibility, right? Yeah. So there's lots of layers around that. One of the things being a part of the not-for-profit community in St. Louis, when I first, as part of a diversity initiative, we went around and visited a lot of the not-for-profits. And many of the not-for-profits, even in areas of St. Louis that are predominantly African-American, the people working at the not-for-profit are white. And it's like, well, what the hell's going on here? Well, it turns out that they have a hard time getting applicants from African-Americans. St. Louis County Police Department's in the exact same boat. They're trying to ramp up the number of black officers they have on the force. They don't have the applications. So these are really interesting questions that people need to actually look into. Why aren't those applications happening? And there's lots of reasons for that. But this is an ongoing issue that we really do need to have a more perspective. And I think there's important conversations to be had about that. There's another point in that. What was the third? There was something else in there.
It was the integration of people with. Well, let me pull it back up just so I don't mess it up. And I'm categorizing a lot of these under what I've labeled as social issues and human rights. And honestly, that was the biggest chunk of comments that we ended up getting. But her third point, basically human rights and social issues. Those were the.
You mean what you're talking about is? Can you frame that? What? I mean, I get that they fall into human rights. So what do you mean?
That's just the label that I put them under, because we've got a lot of them that hit on things like intersectionality, marginalization of people, the treatment of people based on policies and institutions that are in charge of their treatment and care. So this is basic stuff that we want to make sure that we're providing the best care that we have for these people who need it. Does that make sense?
I think so. So you're talking about civil rights and for people who have been, so people who are arrested because they're suicidal, or people that are,
so for instance,
while they're in an inpatient unit, how they're treated there. That's what we're talking about.
So this is a good transition, and I know we're missing that third point from Just Solomon Rainey, but we can come back. But because of what you're talking about, this is a good transition. So Tracy Medeiros said her comment was that there seems to be some issues with the way that insurance companies can decide how long people are treated for, especially if they need more time in the hospital. And she paired that with a comment regarding the actual treatment that she received in the hospital, or the people with thoughts of suicide have experienced in both emergency departments and longer term care. So how can we address things like insurance companies mandating certain periods of time or only paying for a certain period of time in treatment?
This is a great question, and it's one of the things that is a huge area of frustration for me. Here's some interesting news. We have no scientific evidence of any kind that keeping someone in the hospital prevents suicide. So we've got a huge challenge in terms of getting insurance companies to keep people in the hospital longer to prevent suicide, when in fact we don't have a shred of evidence to suggest that keeping people in the hospital prevents suicide. We actually have evidence that hospitalization may increase the likelihood that someone will kill themselves. So there's a huge challenge there with the science supporting hospitalization in terms of a suicide prevention tool. There's many challenges. How do you get an insurance company to do something when they can actually say, where's the scientific evidence that this is the best practice? Well, guys, we absolutely have no evidence for that whatsoever. Now, Joyner did a study years ago, and I want to say this was in the 90s, that showed that, and this was in the average length of stay in the hospital was about 15 to 20 days, which it's now a third of that now in 2018. And they compared treatment as usual to the suicide prevention treatment that was developed, and they did in fact find that actually showed that it had some good outcomes to it. In this day and age, insurance companies are not going to be paying for people to be in the hospital for 3 or 4 weeks. That's just not going to happen, and that's unfortunate. There are parity laws that insurance companies need to cover mental health, behavioral health services the same way they cover medical services. Holding insurance companies accountable to those parity laws, the way they're written, is a bit of a challenge. And let's also discuss the fact that people for medical illnesses, I think this is all healthcare, other non-mental health specific illnesses, the goal is to get people discharged as quickly as possible as well. So there's been a press on our healthcare system to get people out of the hospital. It's expensive. And now what's really interesting about that is to make things even more complicated, there's been a big push to reduce readmissions, right? They don't want people coming back to the emergency department, right? Yep. And they found that putting pressure on hospitals to reduce readmissions actually negatively impacted recovery rates, and the death rate for heart disease and a couple other illnesses was higher when you reduced readmissions, right? So in fact, a lot of the things that they thought, you focus on better care up front, make sure that they get enough care and get connected to appropriate services. It turns out that people often go to the hospital for really appropriate reasons, and trying to convince them not to come back to the hospital may not be a great idea. So we've got lots of mixed evidence. We don't have a lot of good studies on this. And the reason we don't is people are afraid to actually have a study that randomly randomizes people at risk of suicide and hospitalizes some of them and doesn't hospitalize others. Although I do believe Dr. Jobs is doing some version of this with CAMS, where they're looking at some, and I may be misquoting, but I think I heard him talk at a conference one time about there is a randomized controlled study where they're sort of looking at this very issue, right? Now, I'm not a big fan of hospitalization as the course of treatment unless there is something that we can do in the hospital. People who are in a manic episode, people who are experiencing a psychotic episode, people who are under the influence of drugs and alcohol, and people who are so depressed that they're not functioning, where they're simply not able to care for themselves. Those are things where hospitalization makes really good sense to me. And so because they can do something, but most people who are admitted for suicide thoughts are just kept for a few days until they're deemed not at risk to themselves or others. There isn't a whole lot of care going on in the ED. They're racking up huge bills in the process. And then they're often not getting connected to ongoing care outside the system. And that makes it a challenge. So for me, one of the big solutions is we need universal health care. And we need substantial outpatient services and lots of funding so people get appropriate care, that they can get care when they need that care. And that's a big dollar ask, and somebody's got to pay for that. That's the big challenge that we have.
Real honest to goodness care coordination is really what, and I would argue that this is across many diagnoses and disease states. This is a problem with the current system we have versus the system we would like to have, where there's really good continuity of care from hospital acute care to like day-to-day recovery. That's something we'd like to see happen in stroke and heart disease and various cardiovascular ailments. A lot of neurological stuff, a lot of traumatic brain injury, a lot of things could use better wound care, could use better coordinated care, and we just don't have that. Something we would love to have, but right now our system does not value it in the way that we might like. Question number 2. Well, we're on 2 questions after an hour, right?
Yeah, one real quick though. I mean, like one of the other parts is that there are initiatives that are trying to provide funding to implement some of this care coordination.
Sure. Yeah.
But they're so fragmented, and they're not necessarily they're aligned with the treatment or the opportunities available at that particular environment, in that setting. So if a hospital has certain guidelines that they're following, it might be completely different from another institution, another hospital.
Yeah.
So even if
the dream of central management is that you'd have some magical perfect system where you would have a grid, and you would have the hospitals cover their geographic areas, and then you'd have clinics that supported them, and they would all talk to each other somehow by magic. That's not the system we have. That's the one we'd like to have. But nobody knows how to do that. I don't want you to think that like somebody else figured that out. Europe does a better job than we do. Canada does a better job than we do, statistically speaking, as far as dollars and cents as well. But it's not a solved problem. It's something that needs work, not something that like we could just do if we wanted to.
Well, and a big challenge is that in other countries they have a centralized payer source. So in the United States of America, we don't have a centralized payer source. Where you see, and this is where you see where there's a centralized payer source, you see good things happening. The VA, for instance, has actually shown that they have been able to reduce suicide for patients in care, right? And the VA has a really well coordinated care system. They do a wonderful job. And here's the thing, people rag on the VA all the time. I've got bad news for everybody. The reason that you can rag on the VA is because their information is in the public sphere, because it's a government entity, and because of sunshine laws, all of their dirty laundry is out in the open. Private hospitals are not subject to that level of scrutiny. And if you knew what was going on in some private hospitals, and the level of care and the mix-ups and the things that go bad, the only time you hear about them is when there's a lawsuit and it hits the newspaper, and that's really, really rare. So the VA gets dragged through the mud because it's very transparent. And in fact, the VA provides absolutely amazing care, and their care coordination system has shown benefits. And they've reduced the suicide rate because of it.
In fact, the VA has. In fact, if you're in VA care, you know there's many inconveniences and many failings that the VA care has, but one of them is not care coordination. They have a software system that you may love or you may hate, but the fact is that it does have very good handoff between providers for the various issues, and the system keeps that running all the time. And they really do pay it, like the management of VA really pays close attention to making sure that veterans get the level of care that is mandated to provide for them. And it's much better than our private systems. It's stunning.
A couple of tweets. M. Thelking, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, mentioned that in her experience with hospitalization, the admission at first was helpful, if not life-saving, but the longer that she was in there, the more desperate she felt, leading to an increase in suicidal thoughts. So I think
there's a lot of people that report a similar effect, and there's people that report exactly the opposite. Like they feel like they've been kicked out too early. It's a really hairy problem. Okay.
So then Travis Atkinson actually followed that up with what's frustrating about the insurance company limitations is that they don't have hard and fast data on outcomes related to length of stay. So plus the highest chance for suicide post-psych hospital is right after discharge.
It's a
these are
easy answers.
The thread is popping. This is awesome. You guys are great. So let's keep moving really quickly. I think one of the issues that popped up a lot, one of the really popular ones, was regarding people with lived experience and their integration into the field of suicidology. That there still tends to be some discrimination. There's a gap between I heard academic elitism and the ivory tower mentioned in a couple of comments. So there still tends to be this gap between those with lived experience who are trying to get into the field, trying to lend their voices and what they know and their expertise, and the traditional researchers and those in academia.
So this is a really important conversation, and I think there's a lot of room on every side of this issue for improvement. I will say, having been going to AAS for a bit and tracking this for a bit, the level of interaction and involvement of lived experience at AAS, and particularly the AAS conference, is phenomenal. When you go to AAS and look at the number of sessions that are lived experience or loss-based, the percentage is really, really high. So I think that in terms of giving lived experience a voice and having lived experience at the table, I think that we've gotten a lot better. That doesn't mean there isn't a lot of room to work. I will also tell you that lived experience at times, and there's no specific person that owns lived experience, so this is really hard. I mean, I think that's another one of the challenges. You can point at this academy or this research institution or this university and say this or that. It's really hard. The lived experience community is this really large amorphous entity, right? But I will tell you that often people in academia, clinicians often feel attacked by the lived experience movement or members of the lived experience movement, and really crappy things have been said about researchers and about research and about evidence-based practice. And I think that you have people at both ends of this that are not actually interested in an open dialogue, but just at pointing fingers at each other. Right. So there are several things that there are some takeaways about this that I think are really important. One, inside of academia, being open about your lived experience has not been particularly embraced. I think that is starting to change. I think that you're seeing with one of the things that's happening, it's changing. So I think there's some things that there is no doubt that cultural influences on this matter are absolutely huge. And as some older faculty are retiring and kind of falling off, so to speak, and newer faculty are filling in those places, comfort with people disclosing their own lived experience. I think Marcia Linehan was one of the folks that really moved the needle on this a tremendous amount. And it took her how long until she was much further along in her career? What you find out, it took a long time, Tony. What you're finding out now is there's a lot of the younger researchers that are very open about their lived experience and are very comfortable talking about it and are very responsive to it. So I think this is not something that's going to change very quickly because it's very much embedded in our culture. But I think that you're going to see several things. I think as newer, younger faculty move into these positions, being more open about lived experience and embracing lived experience, both their own lived experience and that of others, will become a big deal. A lot of people don't realize it used to be back in the day before I went in graduate school in the early 90s. Everybody had to go through therapy. If you were going to be a psychologist, most programs mandated you had to go through therapy. And we moved away from that. I think that was a horrible thing to do. I think that was a really, really bad thing to do. And so I think that you're going to see things swing the other way again. I think that part of this is how we talk about these issues. I think blaming researchers and attacking people because you don't think that they're doing this or that is probably not the best way to be heard, to be quite honest. And I think because people are upset that they haven't been included, rejecting them or putting them out of hand because they're upset about something is not also a very good approach, right? So I think being able to have open conversations about this, and I think that research that taps into lived experience is incredibly helpful in understanding more about suicide. You can't, trying to understand suicide through a reduction model has proved to be incredibly problematic. It doesn't work very well. So understanding what people are going through and connecting with their experience, their narrative is an incredibly important part. I will also tell you that greater comfort with qualitative research designs would help with this tremendously. And I think that you're seeing some greater comfort with qualitative research designs. I also, and I'm big on this issue, multidisciplinary efforts where we break out of it just being a social work research or psychology research, getting other professions involved will also increase our ability to embrace lived experience. Right? I think those are really important things. And I think that we're seeing a change. Anybody can tell you going to AS in 2012 or being around suicide prevention just 5 years ago, it is exponentially better, but we still have a lot of room for growth.
Yeah. Jess again had a really good point. She said that giving a voice is different than integrating lived experience into every level of knowledge production and dissemination. There are all kinds of examples of this kinds of research practice in other disciplines. And I know that one of the things that you mentioned earlier, and one of the things that Marcia Linehan has talked about as well, is that there just isn't research being done with people who are either currently experiencing thoughts of suicide or come from the lived experience community. That research just isn't happening. And so how are we supposed to inform current implementations of programs and things without having that perspective? How do we?
I don't know what the breakdown is. I mean, some of that research is happening. But remember that suicide of the top 10 causes of death in the United States has the least amount of funding. So the entire landscape for all of suicide research by serious credentialed researchers, you know, people who know what research methods are and who are applying the best science that science has to offer to suicide prevention, is a tiny little piece of the overall funding landscape for anything related to mental health. And then if you look at all disease states, it's minuscule. It's a teeny tiny little portion of money.
Yep.
We spend more money on smallpox. That's the thing the thing that April loves and that we bandy about a lot is that we spend more money annually on smallpox than we do on suicide. There hasn't been a case of smallpox in the United States since about 1960. And it's 40,000 people a year that die from suicide. So interesting. The funding landscape is what it is. NIH, NIMH can be blamed somewhat for this, but it's also a political problem in that there's been no political will, because those of us who care about suicide in the previous 30 years did not stand up and show up at our legislators and demand that there be money set aside for suicide research. Didn't happen. So if we want these things, we have to ask for them. We have to become much more sophisticated, on many sides, and show up where the funding comes from, not showing up at AAS on the other end of it, where everybody is basically looking for dollars to keep their departments running, most of them. And that's if they have a department. Some of them are tucked into larger departments. They just have an office. And when the term ivory tower was brought up, that's what I was laughing at, was that there's no ivory tower in suicide. We might have a white basement, but we do not have an ivory tower. We have no ivory, and the ivory it might have been left there for a while, but it's been taken by the hard sciences a long time ago.
Yep.
The ivory tower has a door with half peeled off stickers and like old tape all over the front of it. Yeah,
from when they moved the math department to the better building, that's when it still has the name of the math professor on the door there. And so that's what most of suicide research is kind of facing day to day. Now, with the exception of there's a top tier researchers that do okay. They're funded pretty well, but that's a very small percentage of this tiny community. The thing that I find fascinating is AS is the oldest and largest organization dedicated to this in the United States. And we've had a real rough time level setting. You know, it wasn't that long ago when lived experience and peer support and conceptually weren't very welcome at AS. And it's dramatically changed in the very short period of time, which is great. But it's also like, there's a struggle of like, well, the academics want to have an academic conversation that has to do with their particular discipline, and that's the conversation they're really at AS to have. And then the lived experience grassroots that really drives a lot of the public narrative about suicide and suicide prevention. They have a totally different conversation that they want to have. Has nothing to do with research methods and like what the current state of risk assessment is from a statistical perspective. They have no concern for that at all. So what a challenge AAS has to find a way to make these conversations collegial and make them productive. And I would love to see us do a better job of it. I've worked really hard to try to make that happen. Personally, but I think that there's a lot more work to do. So anybody who's interested is welcome.
Yeah. We are way into final thought territory. So we're already there. We didn't even get a chance to do a lightning round. But Bart, do you have any final thoughts?
Final thoughts is that the thing that I'm Imma Lose It about the most is emphasizing Tony's point. One of the things, if you take one thing away from this conversation, is that if you don't know this, I'm going to tell you this right now. Suicide prevention is so far down the totem pole of where research dollars and emphasis is put that the researchers that we do have that have dedicated their lives to suicide prevention, hey, give them a shout out, because it's not the most prestigious. They're doing this because they love it. It's the least paying. It has the least money in it. It's the hardest to get funding for. So you want to rag on these researchers, please stop. Because in fact, this is a labor of love for the most part. We spend about $500 million a year on preventing car fatalities. We spend about $30 million a year on federally on suicide prevention. Right here's a shocker: we've actually brought auto fatalities down. In fact, suicide deaths among youth are now higher than auto deaths among youth. We as a nation do not put our money where our mouth is. We do not care enough as a culture about suicide prevention. It is an afterthought. It's an afterthought in academia, period. It should be front and center, because I have a strong belief that the things that prevent suicide are the things that make lives worth living and wellness and health, and that should be our big push up front. If we spent more time on suicide prevention and less on depression, because guess what? Good depression may reduce some suicide, but good suicide prevention reduces more, right? We'd have bent the curve by now. So our funding priorities are way out of whack, and we're too focused on the medical model and genetic research and not on social, cultural determinants of suicide, which I think are much, much larger factors. And we don't have the research funding to support that type of research, right? Where's the money? I don't know.
Yep.
Tony, final thoughts?
I wouldn't dare waste another moment on my rants about funding, and I'm sorry but it's such a reality for me as I visit with so many different, in my position as board chair, I visit with so many different constituencies of AAS, and what it ultimately comes down to is, well, why don't we have multidisciplinary approaches? Well, because there's nobody to pay for them. There's no funding for that. There's scant funding for anything. And I want multidisciplinary approaches. I think that may be where the real solution is for really moving the needle. But somebody's got to pay for it.
Yep. Yeah. No, I will echo all of those things as my final thought as well. Multidisciplinary approach. Funding is obviously an issue. Trying to include everybody that you possibly can inside this problem that we're trying to solve, this massive public health issue. And making a big deal about it. We're not outraged enough. We're not, like Bart was saying earlier, we're not making a big deal about this. This is a relatively big amount of people, and it's affecting even more. Not six, right? Hashtag not six. Yeah. What's the number? What's Julie's number? It's somewhere in like the 114, 117 area. It's a lot of people. A lot of people across the nation are affected by this. A lot of people across the world are affected by this. So I think my final thought would be, let's make suicide prevention interesting enough that people want to talk about it. Make them listen. And then finally, I want to quote one of Marshman's tweets, because this just really, really helped sum up what we were just talking about. If any division of suicide prevention puts on blinders to other divisions, you will fail. Involve everyone. If they don't want to be involved with you, that's their damn problem.
No kidding.
Nailed it. Yeah.
And I do want to say that if you're at AAS, if you are a member of AAS, it's us fighting against the darkness. We are the core. The AAS is the core of suicide prevention in the United States. It represents each community that has a stake, that holds a stake in solving this problem. So if you're at AAS, you should be facing outward, finding a way to grow the tent.
Final comment. Anne-Marie mentioned that there's a long list of things that we clearly did not get to. So Chris is going to hold on to that list. We will work this into another show when we have Doc Foreman to assist with it. And we'll do that. So apparently you are the keeper of the list, Christopher. Is that?
Trello is the keeper of the list.
Trello is the keeper of the list.
We will, and I do want to just express how appreciative we are of you all as the community and providing us with this. I mean, this content today was driven by you guys. So yeah, we will certainly hold on to this. There are so many really, really nuanced ideas and thoughts and comments that you guys had that we'll easily be able to take and create a few more episodes just from these. So thank you, Anne-Marie. Thanks to everybody else who contributed, because you made it. Yeah, you made this a really good conversation. So that's it. You spent another Sunday evening with us on #SPSM. Come back next week when April can save us all.
From ourselves.
Yeah, from ourselves. All right.
Bye,
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye, everybody.